In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to properly use automatic UVs in Maya. Automatic UVs is a function. So if I go to UV editor, I can select an object and run automatic UVs, which will automatically unwrap the mesh for me. However, by itself, this is a very bad option to use if you don't do some work after it. It creates way too many UV shells. It breaks the object up into a lot of these UV islands and introduces a lot of UV seams. So if you just say I'm done here, you're going to have a lot of texture seams in your object. And some of these can be avoided with Substance Painter, I understand, but it creates way too many UV shells for you to do anything properly. So by itself, Automatic Unwrap is not something you just do it once and call it done. You do need to do a bit more work afterwards. So I'm going to show you how to use Automatic UV function properly, how to sew the shells back together and get a nice UV unwrap afterwards. And it's actually very quick to do. Now, this option works best if it's done on box-like or rectangular meshes. So anything that's hard surface and has 6 sides. Think of a cube, just with more detail. So, for example, this file cabinet will work perfectly with automatic UVs. Something like this small wooden cabinet, a bookshelf, for example. Even this desk would work perfectly, minus the handles. The handles are not going to come out very good with unwrap. So you actually use something else and not automatic unwrap for the handles or any cylindrical objects. And I would not use automatic unwrap for a bit more complex objects or especially organic objects. So here I have a chair, and for this option I would not use automatic UVs. This would create just way too many UV shells, and I'll show you later in the video. And for something like this with a lot more curved shapes in an object, I would not use automatic UVs. This would just create a ton of UV shells that would be very difficult to stitch them or sew them back together. So automatic UVs work best on cube-like rectangular geometric shapes of hard surface meshes. So let's go ahead and let me show you how to quickly start using automatic unwrap properly and get a good UV layout going afterwards. Now, before we get into the tutorial, I'm going to go through a lot of options in the UV editor, in the UV toolkit inside the UV editor, with the understanding that you already know how to use some of these functions that you've UV'd before. However, if you don't understand and this is a bit over your head, I do have a full tutorial course that will show you in the 3rd module how to start with UVs from the ground up as a complete beginner. And it'll show you everything you need to know to get started properly and correctly to UV your objects. So you can get this course downloaded with the link in the description box below, or if you're watching this on the worldofleveldesign.com website, there'll be a link to the course in there as well. So let's go ahead and open up the UV editor. And for this file cabinet, just to kind of go over the construction and the modeling portion of this, actually let me close this for a second. I don't have the handles and the little label and tab. I don't have those attached to the object. I'm simply going to focus on the file cabinet itself. And for the cylindrical part, kind of curved handle, I'll cover that in a different tutorial. I would use a different approach. I would not use automatic unwrap for these. And also for these, I would do something different. But I'll cover this in another tutorial. For the file cabinet itself, I've introduced bevels everywhere around the corners, so it has a nice little highlight and a curved geometry around those corners instead of a 90-degree corner. So that introduces a bit of extra geometry to deal with when you UV, as well as I have a bit more indents for the detail for the file cabinet drawers as they would come out. So this object has a bit more detail than you would think. So it's not just a simple rectangular cube exaggerated and stretched out. There's a lot more detail than you would kind of expect from a low poly mesh. So it has a bit more. So that's going to introduce a bit more issues with automatic unwrap by splitting these into a lot more UV shells to deal with. But that's perfect because I'll show you how to deal with them. So I'm going to go ahead and select the object, go to UV editor, and these are the default UVs. And of course they are a mess. So I also have, that I will apply later, a UV grid material that I can check the orientation of all the shells and the checker map that gets applied on it. It makes it easier to UV, but I'll apply it later. So I also have 2 things that are applied to this object. I have under view texture borders enabled, which you want to have this on, so that way you can see the UV texture seams where they are when we apply the automatic unwrap. And they're actually going to show you in the default UVs as well. So make sure you have view texture border, shortcut key is 9, as well as shaded applied, which is shortcut key 5. Usually you'll see wireframe. So you want to make shaded. So that way you can see blue shells or blue color on the UVs is what are the correctly flipped UVs, UV shells, and anything red are shells that are inside out. So now let's go ahead and have the object selected, go to create, and apply automatic unwrap with the default settings. So it's going to take this object and just run automatic unwrap and just use the 6-sided projection that's set up in the default UVs and give us the best outcome that it thinks based on the object itself. So by itself already, this is pretty good. You know, it has all the sides by their own UV shell. It has all the interior portion right here on the inside. So by itself, it's actually pretty good. It has done a pretty good job because of this object's shape, rectangular box-like shape. And this is why automatic UVs are perfect for objects like this. But I don't want to call it done because we're not done yet. So the next step would be is after you run automatic unwrap is to begin sewing some shells together. So the best way to do this is switch over to edge component mode and begin to select where would you want to sew the edges of UV shells so that it's a one continuous UV shell. So by default, if you begin to texture this, you will have a texture seam right here, anywhere where you see a texture border, that thick line. And a lot of times you can hide this inside Substance Painter. A lot of times you can't. So you may want to minimize the amount of texture seams that are introduced into your object. And that's where stitching or sewing shells together comes in. So by switching over to edge component mode and having the texture borders enabled, I can begin to select the edges that I would want to sew together and remove that texture seam, that texture border edge. So I selected those 3 edges at the top, and you just simply apply one of the few functions, either move and sew or stitch together. And you can do this by going to UV Toolkit, going under cut and sew, and you'll have stitch together. Or you can go to cut and sew and use the drop down menu to use stitch together or move and sew. Also, I like to use a shortcut key by holding down Shift, right click, hold. This gives you a context sensitive menu to go to move and sew or stitch together. I use these pretty much interchangeably, either stitch together or move and sew. And the difference between the two is stitch together will simply move the 2 UV shells, stitch them along those edges, and it will transform one of the UV shells to match the other. When you use move and sew, it will not try to match the textile density of one UV shell to the other. So if one UV shell is bigger than the other, it will simply just take those edges and one of the UV shells will be distorted. But stitch together will actually match the UV shells in their textile density. So with those UV shells, those edges selected, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click, hold, and go to move and sew this time. Then I'm going to switch over to UV shell by right click, hold, and go to UV shell. And now I can just take this UV shell and just move it away temporarily. So now I've stitched those at the top. Those 2 UV shells are now together. Go back to edge, and I'm going to continue doing this. And I can do this actually inside the UV editor, but for now, I'll just select the edges inside my perspective viewport. Find that a little easier to use. That way I know exactly what I'm selecting on an object. So I'm going to stitch the UV shell on the side, on both sides, to the main one. So I'm going to select all these, and there's one more right there. And then hold down Shift, right click, hold, and in this case I'll use stitch together. All these UV shells have the same textile density. Automatic unwrap just makes them all the same. So they're not going to get distorted if I use move and sew or stitch together. So now I have another UV shell attached. Let's go back to edges, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. And in this case, I'm going to actually do it inside the UV editor. So that way you get to see that it also works inside the UV editor. So I'm going to select all these on the side, and I can press G to repeat the last use command. And in this case, that was moving the UV shell. So I'm going to hold on Shift. It's not giving me ability to switch over. So let me go to cut and sew and move and sew. So sometimes that context sensitive menu, in that case, it didn't show up. Switch over to edges. And actually, let's move inside these two. So that way they're kind of together. Hey, perfect. And let me check on the bottom. All right, those have been done. So now I have 3 UV shells that have been stitched together, and I won't have a texture seam here on the corners. For the top shell, that's already attached. For the bottom shell, which is going to be this one right here. Let me go to UV shells, select it. I don't need to do anything. I'm not going to attach it on the bottom because that will make this UV shell slightly bigger, and I can actually stick that UV shell somewhere on the corner and maximize my UV space better. And on the bottom, this portion will not be seen. I'm not going to flip this file cabinet over, so I can actually make this UV shell smaller if I need to. I'll keep it for now as is, but I can always minimize that size if I need it because it's not going to be seen. And also, let's do one more UV shell. Let's attach it to the main. You can actually leave the back separated, but because we're kind of working with this, I'm going to go back to edge and I am going to attach it. Because it's not going to really affect the size of the UV shell where I have to do something with it. So I'm going to select all of these edges in perspective viewport and stitch them together. Switch over to UV shell. Now I have one large UV shell that's been attached. Let me select these, just move them out of the way. And now for the rest of this, I don't think I need to do anything with it because first of all, we have the front. Actually, let's combine the front because for the front, I have a face that's part of the drawer. First of all, the UV shell, the texture seam is not going to be seen. You're never going to be here up close looking at this. So I could leave them by their own separate UV shells. But I want to go ahead and combine them so they're, I kind of minimize the amount of UV shells I have. So what I'm going to do is inside the UV editor, I know that each drawer will have each face at the top, bottom, and each side. So I'm just going to select all these right here because that's the drawer front face. And I'm going to stitch them together. Let me move this out of the way. Take this one, select all these 4 edges. Shift, right click, hold, stitch together. And let me move it out. They're kind of overlapping. Let me select these edges. In this case, I'll use move and sew and move and sew. So now I've minimized those. And now I want to go ahead and rotate these shells because they're usually oriented a certain way. And right now they're actually oriented vertically rather than horizontally. So in this case, I already have a material up created for my UV grid material. So I'm going to right click hold, assign existing material, UV grid. And that will give me the ability to see which UV shells may need to be rotated so they can be textured correctly. Then I'm going to select the UV shells for these drawers and I want to orient them the right way. So I'm going to select this one and it's the one on the bottom. I'm going to go to transform and I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. Actually more, the other way, 90 degrees, so I can see the letters. I'm going to take this one as well. Let's rotate it, this one, and one more. Alright, so they've been oriented correctly. And for the rest of the UV shells, if I select them, these UV shells are on the inside portion, which are going to be right there on the inside. So I'm not going to do anything to them or try to stitch them together. First of all, they're not going to be seen. And second, they don't really matter that much. It's just to provide a little extra detail and geometry. So I'm going to leave those as they are. So I've taken care of the main shells. I've minimized the amount of UV shells I have. And now I just want to select all the UVs and I'm going to run automatic layout option. So it can be packed inside the 0 to 1 space. So with the UV selected, I'm going to go to modify layout options. Let's take a look at some of the options here. I'm going to use method on full 3D. And then I just want to come over here to the layout settings. And then I'm going to use texture map size 2048, padding units, pixels, and I want to assign shell padding. Shell padding is the padding of pixels between each UV shell. So I'm going to give it 4. And tile padding is the padding on the corners as it gets close to the 0 to 1 space on the borders. So I'm going to also give it 4. And then I'm going to hit apply. And then it went ahead and packed everything. Made everything the same textile density, and it's pretty good. And actually, from here, I can maximize the amount of UV space that I have by manually moving some of these UV shells into some of these areas right here. Maybe moving some of them around however I want. Maybe even taking that UV shell that's on the bottom of the object that's never going to be seen and making it smaller because it's not that important to us. So you can still kind of rearrange everything to kind of how you see fit and give yourself a little bit more kind of working area. And because eventually I will have additional UV objects such as the handle and the label, then you will need to go in here. I have enough space to kind of stick them in there, either in this empty space or maybe somewhere in the corner. And then if I need to check, I can hit 6 for texture view and just kind of look at the object and see. So as far as UV in this file cabinet, it is done. So you can see how quickly that was when you run Automatic Unwrap and then just start stitching those shells together by selecting edges and then using move and sew or stitch together option. So let me show you. I'm going to move on to some other objects, how quickly you can continue to UV. So for example, another object that's perfect for this is this wooden cabinet and a bookshelf. Perfect candidate for Automatic Unwrap. So I would select this and just run Automatic Unwrap and repeat the whole process again. Give me a bunch of UV shells, but then you just come in here and begin to stitch them together by switching over to edge and selecting where you want to start stitching them. You know, some of these you might want to have them separate. Others you may want to stitch them depending on where you would want or not want a texture seam to appear. So another perfect candidate is something like this, a bookshelf, another kind of rectangular box-like object, hard surface. Again, you would run Automatic Unwrap and then come in here and start stitching the shells together by selecting edges. So I would probably take this edge and take this edge on the actual shelf itself and then stitch those together. And then just continue down to this one and also stitch that together. So now I would have those as separate UV shells, but as one, not as multiple. And just continue doing the same process. Same thing for this desk. The only thing for this desk is, like I mentioned earlier in the video, in the beginning, I would do something very different for these curved handles for the drawer handles. For Automatic Unwrap, I'll just introduce way too many UV shells to use this particular technique. It's actually going to make it a little harder. You could, and then you would have to unfold and kind of make sure the UV shell looks good without any stretching. But I would actually not use automatic to start with. But for the desk itself, perfect candidate. See how clean it already looks, and then you would just go in and start stitching those shells together where you would want them to be one UV shell and minimize the amount of texture seams you have. The only objects that I would not do this on are organic, geometry, as well as anything that has a lot more curvature and cylindrical pieces. So for this, even for this, this looks like more of a box-like shape. However, there's a lot more curves, a lot more shapes here. Maybe for the main shape itself, possibly, but I would actually utilize a different approach for this. So for example, if I go to create automatic, this creates a lot of UV shells. And some of these are pretty good, like the ones on the side, but some of those other ones, like especially for, I mean, this is still not bad. I could probably use it, but it just makes it a little bit more harder and more difficult for you to stitch things together when you have a lot more curvature and more organic shapes to this. You could go to create automatic, go to options and minimize the amount of planes. But then if I minimize the amount of planes, you know, it rearranges the results. If I go more, it's going to break up into way more UV shells than you would need. So that's too much. It looks like a mess. This is definitely not something you would even, this is definitely not a finished product. But then now you have a lot more projected shells to deal with. So I like working with 6 to default. So I would definitely not use this method for this. And then just another example. For this one, absolutely I would not attempt Automatic Unwrap. This would produce a ton of shells, and to fix that would be a pain. So I would use a different method, probably just selecting a set of faces and using planar, then using unfold. And in another tutorial in the future, I will show you how to do something like this. But for example, if I go to create automatic, Let me select the object. You can see how many shells that this creates. This is a mess, and definitely would not use a method to even start for something like this. So Automatic Unwrap is perfect for angular, cube-like rectangular meshes that have definitive 6 sides, and then the great start method that you would just go back into and use the move and sew method to combine a lot of shells together. So Automatic Unwrap is a great technique I use very often. However, if this tutorial kind of went over your head and I covered a lot of things that you may not be aware of or just didn't know they existed, and it's way too much for you, make sure you get that course and begin with the most fundamentals of how to start UVing your objects. And the third module in its entirety is focused on UVing. So we start from the ground up and we cover all the tools inside the UV editor that you need to get started with.